My art forms are spoken word poetry and mosaic, so I'm going to open this talk with a poem, and it's titled Dear America. Being ignored is traumatic. Being seen and not heard, being a body before a person, to have the very essence of your being be stripped away from you before it was ever yours is traumatic. As a woman, I learned to respond to everything except my name. Little lady is not said to me as equal, but to make sure I know my place. I battle with owning my own body and accepting that there is a 1 in 4 chance that a man or a person will lay claim to my body as if they own it, as though it were never mine. See, this is not a new story. It is a historical archetype of generational violence perpetuated by systems of oppression. See, black men and boys were lynched in public. Well, black women and girls were raped and shoved behind, so no wonder the pain and suffering of black boy is so hypervisible. And unless we retrain our eyes, we don't see black girls and they don't see themselves. Our bodies have become the cause to write legislation. Our bodies demand everything except respect. Like Angela Davis, I got into this business to do freedom work. I just settled for my civil rights. So when you ask me what makes me feel safe, I say nothing at all. For years, I tucked pieces of myself into my words, hid my words in my throat, saved all my tears for poems so I wouldn't make people feel uncomfortable. But before I knew who was worthy, I opened my mouth for them. And before I knew who was worthy, I opened my heart to them. And before I knew who was truly worthy, I opened my legs to them. And suddenly, I realized why I never trusted myself. Do you know what it feels like to have a body that doesn't feel like a home? Do you know what it feels like to have to make yourself small? To have to yield yourself to the fragility of masculinity, of patriarchy, of white supremacy. I learned to say yes and please. I learned to say thank you. I learned to say nothing at all. I became loud in places where I should have been silent, and I became silent in places where I should have been loud. Whoever knew the feast other people would have on my silence. So when you ask me what makes me feel safe, the only place I ever truly feel safe is in the sanctuary of a poem. Thank you. So my name is Marline Johnson. I'm an artist, art therapist, and activist. And the question I would love to pose to you all today is, what is your mantra? For me, I have two. The first one is, the scars we have, if we choose to share them, can be lighthouses for other people who are headed towards the rocks that we once hit. And the second one is, we are not always broken, which was the title of my master's thesis. We are not always broken, using poetry and mosaic making as tools for working with survivors of sexual assault and sexual abuse. It was an art-based exploration where I was grappling with the idea of using poems as a psychological vessel and mosaics as a physical vessel when working with survivors. I was motivated by the idea of creating wholeness out of brokenness and the concept of reauthoring one's narrative of trauma. I constantly think about how I turn pain into purpose and think about the untold stories that people carry and bury as a means of survival. I am not my trauma. Sexual abuse is not my story. Sexual assault is not my story. Domestic violence is not my story. Mental illness is not my story. Displacement and relocation is not my story. These are chapters. My story is that of rising up, of strength, of resiliency, of tenderness, and most importantly, one of love. So if you take away anything from this conversation today, I would love for you to begin to think about what is your mantra and or the framework you want your life to be rooted in. My journey of becoming has been married with art for as long as I can remember. Since I was a child, I have used poetry and art as a means of expression to escape and make sense of my reality, which included having a mother who was addicted to cocaine and being a survivor of childhood sexual abuse and later college sexual assault. I tell you this not because I want your sympathy, but to ground you in the chapters that I have overcome in my life. At an early age, I found solace in creatively expressing the things that were much too hard to say. Intuitively, I carry journals with me everywhere I go, writing down images that make me feel something, that make me feel alive. My identity as artist was one that was birthed out of trauma, but became a necessary tool for survival. But along the way, survival transformed into healing and advocacy for others. I first learned about art therapy when I was studying abroad in South Africa. As Colton mentioned, I went to Connecticut College. I studied psychology there and minored in art, and I was there through the Posse Foundation. And one of the things that I loved most about my time at Connecticut was the ability to study abroad. So I first learned about art therapy studying abroad in South Africa. I was having a casual conversation with a young lady in the Commons, and we were talking about the things that we loved, and for me, that was art and helping people. And she mentioned that the university had offered art therapy groups for students in the semester prior. Her exact words were, if art and therapy had a baby, you get art therapy. It's amazing how one conversation can change the course of your life. When I went back to my dorm, I immediately hit the internet. I had to know everything there was to know about what art therapy was and what it had been used for. I had not known what I was going to do until that moment, but in that split second, I knew that I was going to go to graduate school for art therapy. So I got back to campus in the spring, and I immediately started working on my personal statement and thinking about what schools I was going to apply to. It came down to New York University and the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and I know the East Coast folks are probably like, what are you talking about? But I remembered my aunt who used to come from New York to Chicago all the time, and she would take me to the Art Institute, and we would spend hours at the museum talking about art and talking about culture. So at my core, I knew that that was where I was supposed to go. My very first internship when I was in graduate school was at an elementary school on the south side of Chicago, where we were tasked with implementing psychotherapy for 6th through 8th graders. The curriculum was called SPARK, Structured Psychotherapy for Adolescents Responding to Chronic Stress. This particular group of students, the school had deemed unteachable. In theory, they put all of the problem children in a room together and said, figure it out. So truthfully, the SPARK curriculum wasn't a hit. The kids hated it. Every week they ripped up the papers and they weren't engaged. And so after a couple of weeks, my field supervisor and I, we scrapped the curriculum, and she said to me, we are artists, so that is how we will engage these students through art. And coincidentally, the school had been doing a beautification project, so we wrote a proposal to have this particular group be a part of this larger initiative. And the administration said, best of luck, because they didn't think that the students could collaboratively work together. So if you know me, and we're kind of friends now, I always root for the underdog. So the images at the top are a product of the conversations that we had with the students around their dreams for their neighborhood. It was a manifestation of their stories and their voices and the things that they hoped for in their community. And every single time they walked past those murals, they were able to see and be a part of something that was larger than themselves. The second year, I interned at an organization called A Long Walk Home. And they are a national organization that empowers young people to use art to end violence against women and girls. And this is where I truly began to understand the power of art for interpersonal healing and art for social change. Upon graduation, I was hired as program coordinator there, and currently, to date, I sit on the board of directors. At A Long Walk Home, I learned how art and protest are forms of community healing. I learned how to be clinically responsible for the art that I was putting out into the world. I learned the power of testimony and witness. I learned about culturally responsive art and how nail art and hair braiding and twerking can be elevated to fine art. I learned that healing can be joyful. And I learned the importance of including families in advocacy work and having them lead how they want their loved ones to be remembered. So some of the images are from actions that we did. So on the bottom is the brother of Rekia Boyd, who was killed by an off-duty police officer in Chicago. And at the top was a walk that was a domestic violence awareness march that was coordinated by the youth that we worked with and their parents. And then one of the events that sticks with me to this day is a train takeover that we did for a young woman who was killed on a train in Chicago. So with these experiences, in addition to my internships, I was inspired to further my own art-based practice. I applied for and received an art residency, and I led a community mural in North Lawndale on Chicago's West Side. The question that I asked those young people before we started the mural in the elementary school was the same question that I asked these adults years later. What do you hope for? Join me in reimagining a better tomorrow. So over the course of 3 months, I held focus groups, I facilitated free mosaic workshops, and it resulted in the product that you see here. Things that they wanted to uplift were this idea of beauty and perseverance and safety and community on Chicago's West Side, which is a very disinvested neighborhood. So where am I today? I'm motivated to help people explore the idea of creating wholeness out of brokenness. I think constantly about how I turn pain into purpose and rewrite my own narrative of trauma. I think about the untold stories that people carry and bury as a means of survival. You are not your trauma. Sexual abuse is not your story. Sexual assault is not your story. Domestic violence is not your story. Mental illness is not your story. Displacement and relocation is not your story. Those are chapters. Your story is one of rising up, of strength, of resiliency, of tenderness, and most importantly, one of love. So if you take away anything from this conversation today, it's to begin to think about what you want your mantra to be and or the framework of your life that you want it to be rooted in. So again, I ask you, what is your mantra? Thank you.